Hi, I'm Jackson Crawford. I'm here today with my friend Anders Winroth to talk about a book that came out in 2014. Is that right? The Age of the Vikings. Now, when this book came out, I was working at the University of California, Los Angeles. Seems like a little bit of a lifetime ago to me. What were you doing at that time?
Oh, I was working at Yale University in Connecticut.
Yeah, you're going to one-up me.
Well, and I was teaching Vikings a lot.
Now, and is that where the book came from? Was it a textbook for your class?
I mean, it's in a way that's what it became very quickly. It came from I had published a book 2 years earlier about the conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, which is a topic that had interested me for practically my entire life. So I published this. I did a lot of research for it. It was a very hard book to conceptualize because there's so much going on in Scandinavia in the Viking Age. And an editor at Princeton University Press saw the book, and she clearly thought that I had a general book about Vikings in me. Mm-hmm. And she asked me if I would like to write that. And I actually didn't have to think for very long, because I had been teaching Vikings for essentially my entire career, and I had tried different textbooks, and they were all very good, but they didn't sort of fit what I wanted to say.
Well, one of the things that I liked about this book right away when I first saw it is your use of story.
Yeah.
And the way that you lead the reader into the period by, giving us some kind of a narrative and not just lists of facts, right? Like, what does a day in the life look like?
Yes.
Right. Was that inspired by your teaching style?
Yeah, I mean, that comes more or less directly out of teaching. It's stories have resonance, and you remember stories.
Right. More easily than just facts, lists of facts.
Yeah.
Like what would someone eat for lunch? What time would people
Yeah.
eat? Actually giving someone's kind of a scenario is definitely a better way of teaching, I find.
Exactly. No, I like telling stories. I mean, I like telling stories when I'm teaching. Stories, obviously, that are based in reality, in the history that I have studied. But I think it's the most pedagogical way of getting students and others interested.
And what was the idea behind the exact title of this book? Because I find this to be a difficult thing to come up with when you're writing a nonfiction book or even essay.
Yeah. Well, I had a lot of help from my editor and the team at the publisher coming up with a title. They asked me actually not to think too much about the title until the book was written. And then they came up with the title, The Age of the Vikings, which I immediately realized is a problem because there's a very famous book from 1962 by Peter Sawyer called exactly The Age of the Vikings.
Okay.
But Peter was still alive. And after some back and forth with the publisher who really loved the title, I wrote to Peter and said, would you mind awfully if I publish a book with the same name as yours? And I told him how much I admire his book was the book that sort of made Viking studies modern.
Okay.
And he said, he obviously had to think about this too. He came back with a very diplomatic formulation, which was, I have no objection.
Okay, well, if you don't object, then...
Yeah.
Huh.
So I did, and I thank him for it in my acknowledgments in the book.
Okay. Well, part of what I think about with books that have Viking in the title is, I'm interested in what you think about this. I get reluctant to put the word Viking even in the title of a video sometimes, right? Because I think the word evokes so much cultural baggage.
Indeed.
Not always incorrect baggage, but you're bringing with you a certain amount of assumptions when you see that word. In a way that, the age of medieval Scandinavia doesn't quite evoke, right?
No. It's a problematic word for several reasons, one of which being that it's very widely misunderstood. And you know this better than I, but it originally just means a seaborne pirate. Not necessarily Scandinavian, not necessarily from the Viking Age.
Right.
But it has sort of become the catch-all term for Scandinavians. So actually something I try to do in the book is that I make a distinction, I mean not explicitly, but every time I write about seaborne pirates, they're Vikings. But when I write about Scandinavians settling in Iceland or Greenland or Vinland, I talk about Scandinavians.
Right, that makes
or
sense.
Norse people.
That makes good sense.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, you and I and so many others have put Viking on the title of something to be that kind of eye-catching.
Yeah.
But I think that's a great way of using the term more specifically and being disciplined in that way. It's certainly still the age of the Vikings, or Vikings at the time.
There's no doubt about that.
But it's funny that this term that is actually negative in Old Norse
Yes.
as the term that we know these people by.
Yeah.
So,
And it's a term that was actually not very well known in the Viking Age.
right.
If you look through European, non-Scandinavian written sources in Latin and Old English and others, it's very, very rare that the word Viking comes up.
Hmm. Yeah, Old English sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Vikingas.
Yeah, occasionally, but mostly heathen hair.
Right.
Excuse my pronunciation, I'm not a linguist like you are, Jackson.
I think that's pretty close to the Old English.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. Exactly the history of this word is actually richer since the 19th century
Yes.
than I think it was in the Age of the Vikings per se. Well, one of the things that I really liked about this book is that your historical survey of the Viking Age doesn't stick with just the earlier, more violent, more pagan part of it that people usually fixate on in their depictions of the Viking Age. But you carry that history forward into the conversion. And of
Yes.
course, as you mentioned, you've written quite a bit on that subject.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about why that is such an important part of the history of medieval Scandinavia to include in a work like this?
Well, because there were Christians in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, surely from the beginning of the Viking Age. It's also a reaction against what I think is a real problem when we think about conversion. We tend to think of it as shifting from black to white or white to black, depending on your preferences. But it really wasn't. There's a constant flow of cultural ideas, some of which are religious, some of which are openly religious, and some others are not openly religious. So, for instance, the Christians started to, in the Roman Empire, started to bury their dead as non-cremated bodies. And at first this was just what the Roman Empire decided to, not the empire, it was a cultural change that the Christians picked up, and then it became symbolic later on. But the idea of inhumation, as it's called, burying the bodies and not the ashes, crept into Scandinavia long before anybody thinks that there were any real Christians in Scandinavia. So it was just like, okay, this is done on the continent, or people have seen it done, so why don't we do it like that? It seems like a good tradition.
Right, right. If you think of the religion as a set of, say, arbitrarily 100 features, 100 practices,
Yes.
100 beliefs,
Yeah.
you can easily get one centuries before you get
Exactly.
any others. Right.
That's a very good way of putting it.
That's interesting. And there's also, I think, more back and forth between these worlds
Yes.
than we often think about,
Yeah.
where, the Vikings being part of Europe, whatever Europe really means 1,000 years ago,
Yes.
they're interacting with other people in this part of the world,
Yeah.
and they're not being unaffected by it.
No.
Right. And you see also, notions of commerce, means of commerce,
Yes.
currency, and metal and precious metals
Yes.
making their way into Scandinavia. And that's, it's interesting to me because, is that Christian influence? In a sense it is. It's influence from Christians.
Yeah.
But is it influence from, it doesn't come from some Christian holy book.
Well, but you get the coins with the cross on them. So
Yeah,
you get
right.
Christian symbolism. You also get the Arabic coins with the Muslim confession of faith on
Right.
them.
Or occasionally weird sort of fakes of that text.
Yes, yeah. But so I mean, this is part of the 100 features that you were talking about. That okay, here's a cross, and then of course maybe people start using crosses or
Right.
without necessarily associating it with Christianity very openly.
Right. Or without thinking that Christianity is something exclusive,
Exactly.
that you have to buy into that and not into something else.
I think when we as modern people are thinking about the conversion of Scandinavia, we tend to take as a blueprint the colonial conversions in the 19th century with all these missionary societies all around Europe going out to the rest of the world. And the goals of the missionaries was really to convert people from something else to Christianity. So this is what we are looking for, like a wholesale conversion, often crystallized at a particular moment in time. And that's simply not how religion usually works.
Of course. So, in broad strokes, although you can get into narrower strokes if you want, because this is a pretty interesting subject to follow up on, is the conversion of Scandinavia more of a grassroots phenomenon early on, followed by a top-down attempt at imposing the religion? Or am I wrong in characterizing it that way?
I think that's how I would see it. It's grassroots. It's sort of almost like it's the middle level, the people who have traveled, the people who have been out to Europe, what we now think of as Europe, or who have contacts with people from Europe. They are adapting this first, and then it's important when the political rulers embrace Christianity, because they have the means to impose it on the people. The problem with that sentence is, what does it mean,
Right.
the religion?
Right. Right.
And this is something else that I think is often poorly understood, that what the goals were of these rulers, like the missionary kings of Norway, Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson and so forth, was not so much about beliefs, but about practices,
Right.
what you do.
Right.
That you do. And we see this in the Icelandica book, this 12th century treatise or history of the conversion of Iceland, where it says that the Althing decided, supposedly in the year 1000 or possibly 999, that everybody should be Christian, and that means that they should be baptized and they should stop sacrificing to the gods,
Right.
at least in public.
Right. At least in
And
public,
that
yeah.
is what shows that it is about practice and about visible practice,
Right.
where what you do religiously becomes a kind of almost like a political statement of loyalties or orientation.
Right. More of a cultural badge of solidarity or belonging, perhaps,
Yeah.
than the more personal thing we think of today. Because I think you hit on something really important that we so often forget today, which is today we tend to think of religion as a private experience.
Yes.
I can be Christian perhaps even without going to church,
Yeah.
right? Which I think is extremely alien to a medieval conception, where Christianity doesn't have that much to do with what you think and, with what you're thinking about at night. It has more to do with what are you doing are you celebrating the right feast days? Are you fasting on the right days? Are you getting married on the right day and not on the wrong day?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
These practice-oriented conceptions of what it means to belong to a religion are
Yes.
much more important.
Yeah.
And I think it's so interesting to look at something like, is it in Landnámabók, where there's the early settler in Iceland who is praying to Christ most of the time, but
yes.
Thor when he's at sea, because Thor is particularly good at helping people in the ocean or something.
Yeah. No, that's a marvelous story.
Yeah, but it's also, I think, another good example of how there's a transitional period before those Christian practices are considered exclusive.
Yes. Yeah, certainly.
And is there other evidence we see of that?
I mean, there is some popping up here and there, but I mean, it's actually the Icelandic sagas are the best evidence. You can make it on other bases, as I did at some length in the earlier book on conversion, but it's more circumstantial evidence, so it's not really spelled out. But there are things like there's a report from the 960s, written in the 960s in Germany about things that happened in the 960s in Denmark, where there was a Christian missionary named Poppo, who was at a dinner hosted by the King of Denmark, Harald Bluetooth, and at this dinner there was clearly a religious argument about which deity was the most powerful one. And in this context, it says that the writer says that the Danes were of old Christian. And then they converted.
Of old Christian?
Yes.
So that they had actually originally been Christian?
No, that they were Christian since a long time.
Huh.
It's very hard to interpret what he means by this, but it goes to what you were saying. This is evidence that can be used to try to put one's finger on what it means to be Christian. And the way I interpret this is that it is a lot about practices, and that Widukind, the writer, thought the Danes were Christian from a long time ago because of some of the things that they were doing.
Interesting. Huh. Well, that opens up all kinds of questions about what's going on there.
Yeah.
But when you mention the sagas, one of the scenes that, of course, pops to my mind is in Njál's saga, is it? Where the Thangbrander, the missionary,
Oh, right, yeah.
says that that the Christian god is more powerful than Thor.
Yes.
And he's told by this family that they have a berserker who's been tormenting them,
Yes.
who's immune to fire.
Yes.
And so he has 3 fires built in the floor,
Yeah.
right? A control fire, a fire blessed by Thor, and a fire blessed by him in the name of Christ. And it's that fire that burns up the berserker.
Yeah.
And so the family converts.
Yeah.
So you have a little bit more of a transactional relationship with your gods, whether you're nominally heathen or nominally Christian.
Yeah. No, that is certainly true. Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful story, isn't it?
It really is.
It's I take that to simply demonstrate how good storytellers Icelanders were in the Middle Ages.
Oh, sure, no.
I don't take it as historical evidence.
Well, who could take the sagas as historical evidence exactly? I mean,
No, that's exactly.
that's
But it's really good storytelling.
yeah, it absolutely is. And I think there's a grain of truth, even if not necessarily in the specific narrative, in the gist of how someone would be persuaded that this is a religion to check out. It's almost more like the relationship that you see between people and their king in the Middle Ages, right?
Yeah.
Yes, you're expected to be loyal to the one that you were born in the realm of, but perhaps you could be persuaded to show loyalty to some new guy, but you're going to want perks,
Yeah.
right? There are perks to being
Yes.
a Christian
Yeah.
that are being sort of sold to people.
Yeah, there are. And it's not as venal, do you say that in English?
I think that's right. Yeah,
as
that's an
it
interesting point.
sounds. Because all these perks, it's all baked into this system of friendship and honor and gift giving back and forth. That I mean, this is one of the things I argued, that the conversion was a lot about gift giving and being able, as say King Olaf Tryggvason or somebody, to be able to give the gift of Christianity was a very valuable thing for him, because everybody knew that Christianity was, of course, prestigious,
Right.
because it was the religion of the emperor, or both emperors,
Right.
both in the West and in Constantinople. It's the religion of the English king, and everybody knew the English king was so much richer than anybody they ever had heard of, other than emperors, I guess.
Right. Well, and that's an interesting point, that of course the most powerful people that prestigious Scandinavians would probably be encountering during this period
Yes.
would be Byzantines.
Yeah.
And of course that's the Eastern Church.
Yeah.
I've heard, without knowing the specifics, I've heard that Olav Tryggvason had actually imported some Eastern traditions. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very thorny to know exactly what's going on. Not Olav Tryggvason, Olav Haraldsson, of course, also spent time in Russia, in by then Christian Russia, which was embraced Eastern Christendom. So of course they must have brought some Eastern ideas and practices to Scandinavia, and there is some evidence that supports that idea, but it's a kind of evidence that you wish it were clearer.
Sure. Well, and Haraldur was
Yeah, of course.
was a huge Varangian guardsman. That's a stupid way to put it. A huge Varangian guardsman. He was a Varangian guardsman for a long time.
Yes,
And
spent
had
a lot of time in Constantinople.
Yeah, I think even married a Byzantine.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting question related to all this. It seems like what we're looking at is a hugely complex society, like any society is.
Yes.
Religion is part of it, but in a way it's a different part of it than how religion is part of someone's life, for the most part, in the Western world today. It's a more public thing and a less private thing.
Yes, absolutely.
And I've wondered about how that relates to something like the Eddic poems getting written down in Iceland more than 200 years after this act of conversion.
Yeah.
How do you see, and I guess we're wandering all over the place here, but I think these are interesting questions, and you're a good person to talk about them with.
Thank you.
How do you see the context in which something like the poems of the Poetic Edda are written down? What's going on there culturally? Is there any kind of hesitation with a religious basis to writing down stories about these gods, do you think? Or do you think that people had enough of a neutral attitude toward past traditions that there wouldn't be?
I think one has to see this in a European context. It's typical that they were written down when they were in the 13th century, because that was a period when also in the rest of Europe there was great interest in texts from classical antiquity, Latin texts especially, and the Christian Church had actually worked out how it was going to relate to these pagan texts. So they tell the story of Moses leaving Egypt with the people of Israel to go to the promised land from Exodus in the Bible. And one of the things that he does, and I don't know the story very well in the Bible, but I think God tells him to, is to take the silver that he can get his hands on from Egypt and bring it to the promised land. And it's already St. Augustine living in what's today Tunisia, Algeria, in the early 5th century, who works out that this is a symbol of us taking pagan learning into Christianity, in the same way as Moses took pagan silver from the Egyptians into Israel.
It's a little bit of a stretch, but I'll give Augustine a stretch.
Well, this is how they interpreted the Bible throughout the Middle Ages.
Right, heavily allegorical.
Actually, I could show you some people. You have to cut that, but there are people who are stretching much more than that.
Sure,
yeah.
sure.
I mean, some of them are. It's hard to think that they're not crazy, but.
Can I give you a hot take?
Yeah.
And give it to you on camera and see what you think of my hot take?
Yeah, sure.
I think that Hávamál, which is so often taken today or described today as, the quote Viking code of ethics or as something
Yes,
particularly
yeah.
pagan. I think that sure, the individual stanzas and the stories in it have very likely, overwhelmingly, a pre-Christian origin ultimately.
Right.
But I think the act of writing Hávamál down is a profoundly 12th to 13th century Christian act, because
Yeah.
these collations of wisdom are actually quite popular in Europe at that time.
Yeah.
It strikes me, the compilation that we know as Hávamál today strikes me as a Christian compilation of material gathered from potentially older sources.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think that's exactly what's going on. There is this is a time when the so-called Sibylline oracles are very popular, and these are supposedly coming from the Sibyl that's mentioned in, for instance, Virgil's Aeneid, who's clearly pagan, mentioned also in other places in Roman literature, and people love these oracles, which have nothing to do with the original Sibyl. They were compiled over the centuries, but they love them in the 12th and the 13th centuries.
That's an interesting comparandum, because of course the individual prophecies don't necessarily have anything to do with one another per se.
No.
It's just, someone heard somewhere that the Sibyl had said this,
Yeah.
so we're putting it into a list. It's a little bit like that with something like Hávamál, potentially. Someone somewhere had a wise proverb like this,
Yeah.
so we put it together with the other ones.
Yeah.
Huh. That's an interesting comparandum. Now, what do you think we get wrong today? Most wrong, maybe, when we look back at the Viking Age, maybe particularly in the context of religion. We've touched on this a little bit, but what do you think is maybe the biggest misunderstanding we have about this period?
Well, I would go in two directions. One of them is this idea that there is a very clear difference when Scandinavia becomes Christianized. And that actually goes back to what we were talking about Hávamál earlier, that if we say it's pre-Christian, what does that mean?
Right.
Now, when was Scandinavia pre-Christian?
Okay, because pre what part?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yep.
The other thing I think of is violence. I mean, the Vikings are have a very great reputation for being extremely violent. And when we think of them in that way, we sort of fail to see them in the context of their time, which was, of course, a very violent time. What we also fail to see is that practically everything we know about the Vikings, at least everything that's stories that can be told, comes from the people they attacked.
Right.
The European chronicles who are talking about how badly behaved they are. And it's sort of a thesis in my book that, if you take what the Vikings did according to what their victims said, and compare that to what the same people said that for some of the great Christian rulers of Europe at the time, such as Charlemagne, did. What the Vikings did just pales in comparison.
Sure. Certainly on the scale.
On the scale, yes.
Yeah.
But it's described in a different way.
Right.
It's described very negatively,
Right.
because it's the propagandists of Charlemagne who's writing the story that we have.
Right.
We have. Sorry.
No,
Jackson.
please.
We have practically no texts from the Viking Age that's from inside Scandinavia,
Right.
except for the runestones.
Which,
Yeah. And
so and so carved this. And,
yes, so many of them don't really say very much. And then you have the Rökstone, which is amazing.
Right.
But what does it say, and what does it mean, and how do we understand it?
Well, we'll hear more from Henrik Williams about that soon.
Yes.
But this is you're making me think about these concepts of violence and how they play into religion a little bit too.
Yes.
Because I think that there's and surely I've already offended some people with some thoughts here, but and this might offend some others, but I think that there's a very superficial understanding of Christianity that sees it as being more pacifistic
Yeah.
than I think the actual practice of Christianity has traditionally been through history, right?
True, yeah.
Yes, the Sermon on the Mount has a pacifistic tone,
Yes.
but does Acts always have a pacifistic tone? Do the epistles always have a pacifistic tone? Does Revelation always have a pacifistic tone? I mean, Christianity is a lot more than maybe this sounds bad to one person or another, but it's a lot more than what Jesus said, right? It's become this
Yes.
long cultural tradition,
Yeah.
superimposed on a lot of other long cultural traditions. And just because of people stop worshiping Thor and Odin and turn their worship to a new god who said some things about turning the other cheek, it doesn't mean they even know he said those things about turning the other cheek.
Yeah.
And they're still the same people. They're still the same culture. And I think that, you know, we see what I think are really pat, really superficial, really tepid analyses of the Viking Age to say, oh, well, the Vikings stopped raiding when they became Christian. No, they didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. It's yeah, it has nothing to do with it.
Right.
In fact, what happened was that instead of turning their energies towards Western Europe, Swedes and Danes and others started to attack Eastern Europe,
Right.
where there were no chroniclers around, at least none that have any works preserved for us today to read. So we don't know about what they were doing there.
Mm-hmm.
But they were doing these so-called crusades, where they were Christianizing what they called Estonians, in what is obviously today Estonia, but also around, and so forth and so on.
Right, that's like Kurland in the Old Norse
Yes,
text, right?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Now, that's interesting because, of course, if we had records from the Estonians or Latvians about this, probably they would be saying very similar things about these Christian Swedes
Yes.
as what Irishmen were saying about heathen Norwegians 200, 300 years earlier.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. Or if you had any written sources from the Saxons, when Charlemagne spent 30 years conquering Saxony, which is essentially what is today Western Germany, including at one point executing, according to his own chroniclers, his own propagandists, he executed 4,500 people in a single day, and the river was colored red with blood.
Right.
I believe that's exaggerated, but it was at any rate certainly much more than the 111 people that the Vikings are supposed to have executed outside Paris in 845.
Right.
Which is the largest number I've seen claimed for the Vikings for something that is put down as an execution rather than a battle.
Right, even that is surprising.
That is very surprising. Yes, it's a fascinating text. Now I'm getting too enthusiastic. I could talk about it.
Tell us about this a little bit more. I mean,
it's a fascinating text that was written by a monk at the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The church is still in Paris on the left side. And at this occasion, I mean, he's talking about what bad things the Vikings were doing and against the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. They broke into their wine cellar and drank all the wine, what they didn't steal. He's also extremely critical of the French authorities, or Frankish authorities, I should say, in 845, who could not put up a proper defense, as he felt. So he's very opinionated, very charming. He writes relatively poor Latin, which is also interesting because you sort of get the sense that this is not one of these highly learned people that usually writes about the Vikings. This is somebody who's just reporting what he saw or thought he knew.
Right. And Latin is the language in which one does that.
Yeah, I mean, that's in the 800s, really, there were only the English and the Irish who did not write Latin in Western Europe.
It would be strange to see him write an Old Low Franconian or whatever that might be.
Yeah, this is just starting to exist as a language.
But what's interesting to me too is, this isn't a high school English or history paper where I could say something like, violence by people we like is always more accepted than violence by people we don't like, because that's a really obvious statement.
Yeah.
But there's also a little bit of a sense of how we brush off violence by people who we understand a little bit better.
Yeah.
Like, just as a stupid personal example, there's been some violence between members of my family.
Oh dear, I'm sorry.
Well, okay, but like, here's the thing: is I can tell that and kind of laugh about it, like,
Yeah.
ha ha ha, that's so and so, that's so like so and so.
Right.
But I'm related to that person, right? Like, I know this person. To me, I can kind of make excuses and say, yeah, you know, that's just so and so's personality.
Yes.
Which I think is a little bit, maybe at a broader scale, what's going on with something like judging Charlemagne less harshly, because he comes from a similar cultural context. We might seek the approval of Charlemagne or his heirs, who were prestigious people. We're not seeking the approval of the Vikings.
No.
Right. They're from a different cultural context entirely, so there's more of a, you know, how dare these people who come from someplace we don't even know or understand.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's certainly how the people who wrote the chronicles that we are reading about the Vikings, that's certainly how they felt about it. They were, you can sort of read between the lines. They were like, how can these people, how dare they?
Right.
How can they come up with this?
Right. Where did you come from?
Yeah. They came by sea, so there wasn't really anybody around who could report ahead of time that they were on the way, in the way that, you know, Charlemagne had a big army when he called it out, but that moved extremely slowly with, you know, the train of the food and all that. So then there was a rumor that came ahead.
Right. Because someone can always run an hour longer.
Yes.
Or whatever, yeah.
Exactly.
It's not the same with an attack from the sea. And apparently, you know, I'm not well acquainted with the technology, archaeology, the physical culture, but apparently the sail was technology mastered by Scandinavia at a time that it wasn't widely used elsewhere.
The surprising thing about the sail is that the Scandinavians took so long to master it. Because the Romans had sails, and they had sailed on the North Sea, and Scandinavians had at that time, they had very efficient canoes that were paddled by several people that could get up to quite high speeds. We know that because the ones that have been preserved archaeologically have rams in the front. So they clearly used this to ram other canoes.
Right.
And these canoes are the sort of ancestor of the Viking ship, just that the Viking ship adds a sail to it. But that's happened surprisingly late.
Like when?
Well, that is a very difficult question to answer. I say in the book it's around 800,
Okay,
and that used to be what a lot of people thought, but in recent scholarship people have been arguing that it was used earlier. I mean, Viking history is constantly growing thanks to a lot of archaeological discoveries that has been made. I mean, of course in Scandinavia, but also elsewhere in Europe. And you know, there was some years ago, probably 10 years ago or so, that one found this Viking ships on this island in Estonia, west of the mainland Estonia, as it were. That the ships are from probably around 750, and they must have come from the other side of the Baltic Sea. They were not. They were sail ships. So. This is among the evidence that suggests that sail was adapted by Scandinavians before 800.
And is it largely that technology that's prompting this new far-reaching series of raids, or is there something else? Is there something internal? You know, so often I've seen this explanation that there's overpopulation in Scandinavia at the time. Is there anything to that?
No, I mean that's always seemed to me a very ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because if you know anything about history, is that if there's overpopulation, people die.
Right.
And then you no longer have overpopulation. I mean, sadly, before I became a real historian, I used to do a lot of genealogy when I was a teenager, and it's just shocking to see how many members in a family could die. I mean, especially children.
Sure.
And even then it became clear to me that it depended on the social standing of the family.
Mm-hmm.
The priest kids did not die to the same degree as the day workers kids.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Right. Access to more food, different food.
So I mean, it's kind of a circular argument in a way. It's almost the other way around. That if you find a new way of earning your upkeep, then the population can expand, which is, of course, what we saw in the Industrial Revolution or in other processes in more recent history. We know very little about what was going on in Scandinavia in the Viking Age or before the Viking Age.
Right.
But what we do know is that it was a violent place. The canoes I was talking about earlier, for instance, suggest as much.
And whatever exactly the Rookstone says, it does allude to some violence.
Yes, it certainly talks about violence.
You know, the death of a doomed son, it certainly seems like a violent event.
And battles, I forget, a lot of battles.
Yeah, and war booty, which might be part of a riddle.
Exactly. But whether or not it's part of a riddle, it's still war booty.
Right, right. Well, so we've talked a fair amount about some kind of universal things here, about conversion, how that might happen, about violence, about mortality. What is it special about the Viking Age that has so many people coming back to this period and this place again and again? What do you think makes us so fascinated with this time?
I think that actually goes back to where we started. It's a lot of really good stories.
Yeah.
And some of those stories are, I mean, maybe I shouldn't say some, but most of the stories are actually written in the Middle Ages, the Icelandic sagas. The ones that are about the Viking Age, they contain really good stories. And people have for the last 200 years been retelling those stories and sometimes been able to make them even better stories. Or, you know, more suitable for our time.
Right.
Might be less. I'm not a literary scholar, I'm just a historian.
Next we're going to rank adaptations of sagas, but okay. Yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, there is a film I haven't seen, The 12th Warrior.
Oh, the 13th Warrior?
The 13th
I know what you're
Warrior,
talking about.
I'm sorry, yes.
With Antonio Banderas?
Yeah, yeah. Which was very popular at its time. But that's based on a medieval story by Ibn Fadlan, who went to see...
The first part of it is based on that.
Yes.
And then it's based on Beowulf.
Yes, which is also a marvelous story.
It's actually, this is another hot take, it's actually not the worst Viking movie by far.
Good.
So...
What is the worst Viking movie by far?
I don't know. Probably one I haven't seen because I don't typically like them.
Yeah.
What do you think? Are there any you like?
I mean, I haven't seen a lot. I mean, the one that is a comedy with the Monty Python gang. Okay. I think that's really hilarious.
Are you talking about Njorl's saga?
Say it again?
Have you ever seen Njorl's saga? They call it that. It's a parody of Njorl's saga that Monty Python did.
All right. No, I have not. I didn't even know about that.
Yes.
I should check that out.
The best part of it is when they introduce a character, they play it as a joke that they give a genealogy for him that has something like 35 members.
Knew Harold, son of Gernund, son of Eric from Vidalis, son of Arvard Bristlebeard, son of Harkon, who killed Bjortgard in Soknedale in Norway, over Gudrid, daughter of Thorkel Long, the son of Kettletrout, the half-son of Halvdan Halftroll.
He's the son of, the son of, the son of. They play it as a joke, but it's actually from Nilsson.
Yeah. That's how sagas usually begin. Yeah. I mean, as I joke about. Yeah. Icelandic sagas usually begin that there was a man in Norway. His name was, and he had a son, and he had a son, and then he moved to Iceland, and then.
I'm looking at you, Ale Saga.
Yes.
But okay. So, but are there any Viking movies that you definitely don't like?
That would be rude to say.
Okay.
I have seen, there is an old movie that's called The Longships that has a really high-level cast with Tony Curtis and Ernest Borgnine, and Richard Widmark plays the main Viking. And it's sort of almost a turkey. You can see, if you look at the film, I think, and I'm not a film critic, I'm just a poor historian, if you look at the film, Richard Widmark doesn't believe a line he's saying. He's like, yeah, they're paying me to say this.
Have you ever seen or heard of The Island at the Top of the World?
I have heard of that, I haven't seen it.
It's from about 1974. It's a live-action Disney movie that Disney has suppressed, probably because killer whales are villains in it.
Killer whales?
Yeah, people kill orcas in it, which is maybe not so popular now. But the funniest thing about this to me is the premise is that there's a surviving colony of Vikings at the North Pole.
All right. Huh.
Okay, so the cast is, as far as I can tell, the cast of Vikings are all actual Norwegians.
Right.
Most of them agreed, apparently among each other. I've never found any documentation about this, but they all speak in like textbook 6th grade Nynorsk.
Good.
Like not a dialect, but like Nynorsk. But the one bad guy Viking speaks Rikssvenska.
Rikssvenska.
He sounds like a boulevardier from Stockholm.
All right. I'm sorry about that.
But it's such a funny, like, why is the bad guy the Swede? You know?
That seems worth checking out.
It's really funny, and they don't subtitle any of it, so it's just, bad guys speaking barbarian language. But if you know the difference, it's this hilarious contrast between the bad guy Swede and the nicer guy Norwegians.
Yes.
I don't know why they did that.
Have you seen this Norwegian series? That's sort of a joke series about Vikings. The Norseman, I think it's called.
I haven't.
In English. It's funny because it's sort of recorded twice, once in Norwegian and once in English, by the same actors.
Huh.
So in other words, they speak with, and I think they're encouraged to speak with heavy Norwegian accents when in the English one.
Of course.
And it's like, I think it's slightly surrealistic, and there's the Viking or the Norwegian who really wants to be a Viking but is not very good at it or anything, and there's the Norwegian who's married to a woman who loves poetry. So they go. Let's have a poetry evening. Let's go to this guy. He's so great at reading poetry, and he goes there and he's reading Völuspá in Old Norse.
That's fun. Yeah, that is fun. I haven't seen it, and there's also Beforeigners, right? Or
yes,
something like that,
which takes place today. I mean, it's a marvelous Norwegian series. It takes place today, or where there are people showing up in the Oslo harbor, and they have just managed to fall into some hole in ancient times, and they come to the present time. Yeah. And what's really funny about it is like there are a lot of people from the Viking Age, including Saint Olaf Haraldsson. He shows up and becomes a kind of an evangelist. Huh. And the Old Norse people, they speak Old Norse.
Yeah.
And then you have people coming from even further away, and they speak something that I'm not a linguist and cannot tell, but it sounds like what I imagine that Proto-Germanic would sound like.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I approve of the concept.
Yeah.
But, people like you and me spent a lot of time writing and reading.
Yes, I mean that is. I was going to say that I have not seen as many films as I probably should have.
Yeah. And you, audience, here's my segue, probably haven't read all the books you should have. And one of the books that you should read is definitely The Age of the Vikings, which I think
Thank you.
really is. I use it as a textbook at Berkeley in Colorado in Vikings classes. I think it's a great entree into that cultural world. You know, we're both more text-based people than archaeologists,
Yeah.
obviously. And I think a lot of these books having more of an archaeological perspective, is that fair to say?
Yeah, that a lot of books have very good archaeological.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying it's I'm not saying it's wrong or bad,
No.
but it's more in line with what I'm thinking about as as something that I want to introduce is the culture, the literature, the humanistic side.
Yes, yeah.
And I think your book does that extremely well.
Thank
So
you very much.
I hope you'll check it out. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation about all kinds of Viking stuff.
Yes.
And from beautiful Norway, we'll wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course.